What happens when a beloved television star finds himself caught in a web of assumptions and misunderstandings that spirals completely out of control? Today, we're diving into one of the most shocking moments in daytime television history, when David Boreanaz, the man who captivated audiences as Angel and Special Agent Seeley Booth, found himself in an explosive confrontation with Kelly Clarkson that nobody saw coming. This wasn't your typical celebrity interview gone slightly awkward. This was a full-blown meltdown that had everyone in the studio questioning what they just witnessed. Before we get into the details of how this all unfolded, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think really triggered this entire situation. Because trust me, by the end of this story, you're going to have some serious thoughts about who is really in the wrong here. It started like any other episode of the Kelly Clarkson Show. Kelly was in her usual upbeat mood, ready to chat with David about his latest projects and maybe share some laughs about his decades-long career in Hollywood. The audience was buzzing with excitement, many of them longtime fans of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Bones, who had been waiting years to see David in this kind of relaxed, fun setting. Kelly opened the segment with her characteristic warmth, welcoming David to the show with genuine enthusiasm. "David, it's so wonderful to have you here. I have to tell you, I was such a huge Bones fan, and honestly, I think I had a bit of a crush on Booth," Kelly said with a playful laugh, settling back in her chair. The audience chuckled along, and David smiled politely, though something seemed slightly reserved about his demeanor. "You know, Kelly, that's really kind of you to say. The show meant a lot to all of us who worked on it," he replied, his voice measured and professional. But Kelly wasn't done with the Bones references. "I mean, seriously, the chemistry between you and Emily Deschanel was just incredible. Did you two ever, have any real-life moments where you felt that spark?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and David's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Well, Emily is a consummate professional and a dear friend. We had great working chemistry, but that's really all there was to it," he said, his tone becoming slightly more clipped. Kelly seemed to miss the subtle warning signs and pressed on. "Oh, come on, you can tell me. The fans always wondered if there was something more going on behind the scenes. I mean, when two people have that kind of on-screen magic, there's usually at least a little something real there, right?" She leaned forward with an encouraging smile, clearly expecting David to share some juicy behind-the-scenes gossip, or at least play along with the speculation. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening slightly. "Kelly, I think you're misunderstanding something here. Emily and I worked together professionally for 12 years. She's married, I'm married, and we respect our relationships and our families. There was never anything inappropriate happening, and frankly, I'm not sure why we're even discussing this," he said, his voice taking on a firmer edge that seemed to catch Kelly off guard. But instead of backing down or changing subjects, Kelly seemed to interpret his response as playful resistance. "Oh, you're being so coy. That's exactly what someone would say if there really was something there. Come on, David, this is a safe space. We're all adults here." The audience laughed again, but this time the energy felt different, more charged and less comfortable. David's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, real irritation flashed across his face. "No, Kelly, I'm not being coy. I'm being honest and trying to maintain some dignity here. What you're suggesting is not only inappropriate, but it's disrespectful to both Emily and our families. I came here to talk about my work, not to fuel gossip about my personal relationships," he said, his voice rising slightly above its normal conversational level. Kelly seemed momentarily taken aback, but quickly tried to smooth things over with a laugh. "Whoa, okay, I clearly hit a nerve there. I didn't mean anything by it. I was just having fun with the fans' favorite theories. But speaking of relationships, I actually wanted to ask you about something else I heard." She paused dramatically, and David's expression grew even more wary. There have been some rumors floating around about some tension on set during the later seasons of Bones. Some people are saying there were some pretty intense disagreements between cast members about the direction of the show. David stared at her for a long moment, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Where exactly are you getting this information, Kelly? Because I have to say, this interview is taking a turn I definitely wasn't prepared for," he said, his voice now clearly strained with the effort of maintaining his composure. Kelly's smile faltered for just a moment before she regained her composure, but there was something different in her eyes now, a kind of determined glint that suggested she wasn't going to let David's obvious discomfort derail her line of questioning. "Oh, you know how Hollywood is, David. People talk, stories get around. I'm just curious about your perspective on some of the things I've been hearing," she said with a casual shrug that felt anything but casual. "What kinds of things exactly?" David asked, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. The audience was beginning to sense the shift in atmosphere, the earlier lighthearted energy replaced by something much more tense and unpredictable. Kelly leaned back in her chair with the confidence of someone who thought she had the upper hand. "Well, For instance, I heard that there were some pretty heated discussions about storylines, particularly regarding your character's development. Some sources suggested that you weren't always the easiest person to work with when things didn't go your way, she said, her tone taking on an almost investigative quality that seemed completely at odds with the usual format of her show. David's face went completely still, his eyes never leaving Kelly's face. Sources, he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. What sources would those be, Kelly? Because I'm starting to get the impression that this entire interview was set up under false pretenses. Oh no, David, that's not what this is about at all, Kelly said quickly, but her protestation sounded hollow even to her own ears. I'm just trying to give our audience a real, authentic conversation. People want to know the real you, not just the polished Hollywood version, the real me. David's voice was rising now, and several audience members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The real me is someone who has worked in this industry for over 25 years, who has always conducted himself professionally, and who has never had to defend his character or work ethic to a talk show host who apparently thinks ambush journalism is appropriate for daytime television. Kelly's face flushed, but she pressed forward with what was clearly becoming a disastrous decision. Look, I'm not trying to ambush anyone here. But when you're in the public eye, people are naturally curious about the real story behind the scenes. And frankly, some of the people I've spoken to paint a picture of someone who could be pretty demanding when things didn't go his way. Some of the people you've spoken to. David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sharp sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent studio. Are you telling me that you've been actively seeking out negative information about me before inviting me on your show? That you've been conducting some kind of investigation into my professional conduct? The studio had gone completely quiet except for the low hum of the cameras that were still rolling, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming one of the most uncomfortable interviews in recent memory. Kelly looked genuinely shocked by the intensity of David's reaction, but instead of backing down or apologizing, she seemed to double down on her approach. I think you're overreacting, David. This is just normal interview preparation. Every host does research on their guests, Kelly said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence, and there was a slight tremor that suggested she was beginning to realize she had badly miscalculated the situation. Normal interview preparation? David's voice was incredulous now, and he took a step toward Kelly's desk, his hands clenched at his sides. Normal preparation is reading about someone's current projects, their career highlights, maybe some fun personal details they're comfortable sharing. Normal preparation is not digging up gossip and unsubstantiated rumors to blindside someone with during what they thought was going to be a friendly conversation about their work. Kelly tried to regain control of the situation, her media training kicking in as she attempted to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Okay, I can see that I've touched on some sensitive topics here. Why don't we just take a step back and talk about your new projects? I know you've got some exciting things coming up that our audience would love to hear about, but David wasn't having any of it. No, Kelly, we're not just moving on from this. You can't throw around accusations and implications about my professional conduct and then just brush it off like it was nothing when you realize you've crossed a line, he said, his voice carrying a controlled fury that was somehow more intimidating than if he had been shouting. The tension in the studio was now palpable, with audience members looking around nervously at each other, clearly unsure whether they should be witnessing what was unfolding before them. Kelly's producers were visible in the background, making frantic hand gestures, but it was unclear whether they were trying to signal her to continue or to wrap up the segment immediately. Kelly made one more attempt to maintain her position, but her voice betrayed her growing uncertainty. David, I really think you're taking this the wrong way. I'm a fan of your work, and I was just trying to have an honest conversation. Sometimes, the truth isn't always comfortable, but that doesn't mean we should avoid talking about it. David let out a short, bitter laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. The truth, Kelly, you don't even know what the truth is. You've based this entire line of questioning on what anonymous sources with anonymous complaints. Do you have any idea how damaging it is to spread unverified gossip about someone's professional reputation on national television? I'm not spreading gossip, Kelly shot back, her own frustration finally beginning to show. I'm asking legitimate questions based on information I've received from credible sources within the industry. Credible sources. David's voice was getting louder now, and his famous composure was completely gone. Name one, Kelly. Give me one name of someone who told you I was difficult to work with. Just one name of someone who actually worked with me who said anything negative about my professionalism. Kelly opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence stretched for several long, excruciating seconds as it became clear to everyone in the studio that she couldn't, or wouldn't, provide the names David was demanding. That's what I thought, David said, his voice dripping with contempt. You've built this entire ambush on rumors and secondhand gossip. And now you're sitting there expecting me to defend myself against accusations you can't even properly substantiate. Kelly's face was now bright red, whether from embarrassment or anger. It was impossible to tell. Look, David, I don't think it's unreasonable to ask about your work relationships. You're a public figure, and people are naturally curious about what you're like to work with. There's a difference between curiosity and character assassination. Kelly, David fired back immediately. And what you're doing right now feels a lot more like the latter than the former. You invited me here under the pretense of a friendly interview, and instead you've turned it into some kind of trial where I'm supposed to defend my reputation against anonymous accusations. The camera operator was clearly struggling with where to focus, alternating between close-ups of David's angry face and Kelly's increasingly flustered expressions. The audience had gone from uncomfortable murmuring to complete silence, as if they were afraid that making any noise would somehow make the situation even more volatile. I never said anything about character assassination, Kelly protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I was just trying to get to know the real David Boreanaz, the person behind the characters, by attacking my professionalism, by suggesting that I'm difficult to work with based on rumors you heard from people you won't even name. David's hands were shaking slightly now, whether from anger or adrenaline. That's not journalism, Kelly. That's tabloid garbage. And I expected better from someone with your reputation. Kelly's composure finally cracked completely. My reputation. You want to talk about reputation? You're the one standing there having a complete meltdown on live television because I asked you a few tough questions. Maybe the real question here is why you're so defensive if there's nothing to hide. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and for a moment, the entire studio seemed to hold its breath. David stared at Kelly with an expression of such pure disbelief that it was almost frightening to watch. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that the microphones barely picked it up, but every word carried the weight of, barely contained, rage. Nothing to hide, he repeated slowly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just heard. Kelly, I have spent my entire career building a reputation based on hard work, professionalism, and respect for my colleagues. I have never, not once, been accused of being difficult or unprofessional by anyone I've actually worked with. And now you're sitting there suggesting that my reaction to your baseless accusations somehow proves that those accusations are true. David's face had gone from flushed with anger to an almost frightening calm, the kind of stillness that comes right before a storm breaks. He took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was steady but filled with an icy determination that made everyone in the studio lean forward despite themselves. Kelly, I want you to listen to me very carefully, he said, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. I came here today as a favor to your producers, who assured me this would be a light-hearted conversation about my career. Instead, I find myself being interrogated about my character based on information you claim to have but refuse to substantiate. That's not just unprofessional, it's cowardly. Kelly's mouth fell open, clearly stunned by the directness of his words. Cowardly, David. I think you need to calm down. You're making this into something much bigger than it needs to be. Calm down. David's voice rose sharply, and several audience members actually flinched. You just accused me of having something to hide, because I refused to dignify your gossip-mongering with a response, and now you're telling me to calm down. Do you understand what you've done here today? Do you have any idea how this looks? Kelly tried one more time to regain control of the narrative, but her voice was shaky now, all pretense of confidence gone. I was just doing my job, David. Sometimes that means asking the hard questions that other people won't ask. Your job, David laughed, but it was a harsh sound with no warmth in it. Your job is to entertain people and make your guests feel welcome, not to ambush them with unsubstantiated rumors dressed up as legitimate inquiry. And the fact that you think what you're doing here constitutes journalism shows exactly how far this industry has fallen. He began walking toward the edge of the set, but then stopped and turned back to face Kelly one more time. You know what the most frustrating part of this whole thing is? I actually respected you before I came here today. I thought you were one of the good ones, someone who understood that there's a difference between entertainment and exploitation. Kelly's face crumpled slightly, as if she was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. David, please, can we just start over? I obviously misread the room here, and I apologize if I made you uncomfortable. But David was already shaking his head, his decision clearly made. No, Kelly, we can't start over. You can't unsay what you've said, and you can't undo the assumptions you've made. This interview is over. He reached up and unclipped his microphone, the small action somehow carrying enormous weight in the stunned silence of the studio. David, wait, Kelly called out, standing up from her chair for the first time during the segment. Please don't leave like this. We can edit this part out. We can reshoot, whatever you need. David stopped at the edge of the stage and turned back one final time, his expression a mixture of disappointment and disgust. Edit it out, Kelly. That's exactly the problem. You think you can say whatever you want, cross whatever lines you feel like crossing, and then just pretend it never happened when there are consequences. That's not how real life works, and it's certainly not how professional relationships work. He looked out at the audience, many of whom were now openly staring in shock at the spectacle unfolding before them. "I apologize to all of you for having to witness this," he said, his voice softening slightly as he addressed the confused and uncomfortable crowd. "You came here expecting entertainment, and instead you got to watch someone's reputation get dragged through the mud based on anonymous gossip." With that, David Boreanaz walked off the set of The Kelly Clarkson Show, leaving behind a stunned host, a speechless audience, and what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked about television moments of the year. Kelly stood frozen at her desk for several seconds, clearly unsure of how to proceed, before finally sitting back down and looking directly into the camera with an expression that mixed defiance with uncertainty. "Well," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I guess that's not exactly how any of us expected this conversation to go." The cameras kept rolling for a few more seconds, capturing Kelly's bewildered expression and the confused murmur of the audience, before finally cutting to commercial. But the damage was done, and everyone in that studio knew they had just witnessed something that would be replayed, analyzed, and debated for months to come. What started as what should have been a simple, friendly celebrity interview had devolved into a masterclass in how quickly things can go wrong when assumptions are made and boundaries are crossed. The question that everyone was left asking was whether Kelly had genuine information that justified her line of questioning, or whether she had simply gotten caught up in the excitement of potentially breaking some kind of exclusive story and lost sight of basic professional courtesy in the process. So what do you think? Was David Boreanaz justified in his explosive reaction to Kelly's questioning, or did he overreact to what might have been innocent curiosity taken too far? Was Kelly out of line with her research and her approach, or was she just doing what any good interviewer should do by asking the tough questions that everyone wants answers to? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more shocking celebrity moments that you definitely won't see anywhere else. The truth is often stranger than fiction, and sometimes the most explosive moments happen when you least expect them.